How knowledgeable are you when it comes to Dragon Ball? And what would it take to get a master's degree in discussing Dragon Ball? Well, in today's video, we are going to discuss the 7 levels of Dragon Ball knowledge, going all the way from an absolute noob all the way to a Dragon Ball god, as I have witnessed all levels in the Dragon Ball community over these years, and we will discuss it today. Now, the first thing that we have to do is we have to talk about the noob. Now, what exactly is a Dragon Ball noob? A Dragon Ball noob is somebody who has just heard of Dragon Ball. You may have played a few games, you may have seen a few episodes on Toonami, you may have watched a few Kai episodes, you thought it was pretty cool, but you never really dived deeper into the series. You just are like one of those people that, yeah, it was fun, I got into it a little bit, but I never went further than that. And as a result of it, considering how massive the Dragon Ball franchise is, you are definitely considered a noob when it comes to Dragon Ball. Now, when we move on from the noob tier, we are going to go on to the casuals, which is where a lot of Dragon Ball fans lie, where this category would be somebody who saw the entirety of Dragon Ball Z Kai, saw the entirety of the original Dragon Ball Z anime, and may have watched a little bit of GT or Super or Dragon Ball, or even watched those but didn't watch so much of Z. You really dive deep into one of the specific Dragon Ball animes, but you didn't really watch the entirety of the Dragon Ball anime, and you didn't really get much into the other aspects of Dragon Ball. So as a result of that, you would be considered a casual Dragon Ball fan. Now, moving on from here, this is where I think a lot of Dragon Ball fans lie, and this is what I consider the associate level of Dragon Ball, because if you're watching this video on YouTube, you're probably at least an associate. I doubt you would be a noob or a casual if you were watching this video, because you're watching a guy talking about Dragon Ball on YouTube, which means that your natural involvement in the show is going to be higher than most fans. And I feel like because of this, you would probably be an associate or higher. And an associate is basically somebody who watched the entirety of the Dragon Ball anime. Now, this is not an easy task, and this is what separates most casual fans from fans that are actually more adept into the series, because of the fact that if you watch the entirety of Dragon Ball, this is a total of 639 episodes of the Dragon Ball anime, when you're considering 153 episodes from Dragon Ball, 291 episodes from Z, 131 episodes from Super, even though technically Super came after GT, and then if you include that, that would also include 64 episodes of Dragon Ball GT. So including all of that, you get 639 episodes, and for anybody to watch 639 episodes of a franchise, you have to be pretty hardcore as a fan to do something like this, in addition to watching most of the Dragon Ball movies. You may not have seen all of them, and you may not have seen every special, but you definitely have an overview of most of the Dragon Ball movies. Now, moving on from the associate tier, we have the bachelor tier. Now, the bachelor tier is where we go into the fact that you read the entire Dragon Ball manga. So you basically did everything that a person below you would have done, like watching every single episode, but you read every single chapter of Dragon Ball, and you will be shocked to know that most Dragon Ball fans have not read the entire Dragon Ball manga, going all the way from the original Dragon Ball to Dragon Ball Z's manga, even though, like I said before, there was originally one Dragon Ball manga, but Viz split it and called the second part the Dragon Ball Z manga. And then after this, including Dragon Ball Super's manga, then with all of that said, if you've read the entire Dragon Ball manga, then you're definitely at least a Bachelor's fan, because that requires an extra amount of effort into watching everything and reading everything, which means that your involvement in Dragon Ball is definitely a lot higher. And in addition to this, you would have done all of the other things like watching even more Dragon Ball movies. So this would now take us into the master tier. Now, the master tier is where it gets a little bit different, because the master tier is when you start to have knowledge about dubs, and this is also when you start to have knowledge about different Dragon Ball manga translations. Now, the master tier is specifically when you have not only read the entire Dragon Ball manga or watched the entire Dragon Ball anime, but you watched it in Japanese with its original translation, in addition to your native language, which I'm assuming is probably English, but there's many of you who probably don't speak English natively, but learned English throughout your life, and probably watched a German dub or a Spanish dub, and as a result of this, in addition to watching it in Japanese, that takes you to a completely different level, because when you watch Dragon Ball in Japanese, your knowledge of the show is going to increase exponentially, because of the mere fact that now you are going to have an identity in discerning the differences between the original Dragon Ball, or what most people would call the Funimation dub, and what they said in that, in addition to what was said in Japanese. So when you get to the point where you can pinpoint the differences between what was said in the Japanese, what was said in the English dub, and what was also said in the manga, if you can break down all three of those in addition to a fourth thing, which is what I call discussing rare specials, which is something that most casual fans can't watch. Like, this is something that you'd have to go out of your way to watch. So something like watching the original Plan to Eradicate the Saiyans, or the Summer Vacation special, or episode of Bardock, or Yo Son Goku and his friends return. These are things that you can definitely watch, but you can't watch it normally. Like, you have to make a concerted effort to go out of your way to watch these specific specials because they weren't released normally. And if you did this in addition to the other three things that I have mentioned, then you were definitely a Dragon Ball master. But now we move on to what it would take to be considered a doctorate. Now at this level you were basically a Dragon Ball historian. And to be specific, in order to be a doctorate, you would have to be somebody that is well versed in Dragon Ball knowledge outside of the actual things that have been produced. If you were already a Dragon Ball master and you want to become a doctorate, the best way to do so would be to go to Kanzenshu. Kanzenshu is the website I would say is the gateway from bachelors and masters to the doctorate level, because the amount of knowledge that is on Kanzenshu is off the charts. They have knowledge in terms of production, but most importantly, what you also have to know is that when you are a doctorate, you now have knowledge about things that have been directly said about the show, even if it wasn't directly in the anime or the manga or any of the movies or TV specials, where you can read a Toriyama interview and hear what he had to say about something specific. So for example, if you go to Kanzenshu and you read a lot of these interviews, you will see that Toriyama will say things like Dr. Gero modeled Android 16 after his dead son. Or you will also gain knowledge about character names such as Lapis and Lazuli being the official names of Android 17 and 18, even though they've never been called that in the official show itself. Now as a post editor, I wanted to give you the quintessential example of how a Dragon Ball doctorate thinks versus how a Dragon Ball master thinks, and it gets very specific because we learn about the evolution of retcons within Dragon Ball, because we have to understand that there are real people that make Dragon Ball and there are real reasons for changes within the show. So we're gonna go back to the Android arc for just a second and remember when Trunks showed up, and in the original manga, Trunks states that androids 19 and 20 were the original androids that terrorized his future. Years later, the androids show up and it's androids 19 and 20. Those were the same numbers that Trunks mentioned. But Trunks says that these aren't the same androids, and then when androids 17 and 18 showed up, he states that those were the androids that terrorized his future. Now, the thing that you have to understand about this is that Toriyama's former editor, he wasn't Toriyama's editor at the time, but his former editor, Torishima, said that you're gonna make the arc about an old man and a fatso, so he introduced androids 17 and 18, and then he once again came back and said, so you're going to make the arc about two delinquent teenagers, and then Toriyama eventually created Cell. And then even after Cell showed up, there's a reason why Toriyama made a second form and a third form, because Toriyama's current editor at the time, Kondo, stated that the original Cell in his imperfect form looked ugly, so then he made semi-perfect Cell, but then when he made semi-perfect Cell, his editor thought that he looked like a moron, so then he eventually made perfect Cell. And to be specific, Toriyama directly said that semi-perfect Cell was supposed to have a much larger role in the Dragon Ball story, but because of external factors, as we discussed before, he was pressured into creating perfect Cell. So with that said, if you have that next level knowledge of Dragon Ball, you will understand the real life reasons why certain things were changed in the show, as opposed to just watching and reading it and thinking Toriyama just made this and that's just the way the show was supposed to be. But apart from Kanzenshu, another way you can be a doctorate is if you know people who also have direct connections with the show, which would put you on the level right next to the level that we will finish this video off with. But this takes us to the one above all, and the highest possible level you can be in terms of Dragon Ball knowledge, which is beyond being a Dragon Ball fan. And this is the God tier. Now, what would it take to have God tier knowledge of Dragon Ball? In order to have God tier knowledge of Dragon Ball, you actually have to work on the show. There are people who are producing watching the show that know things, or people who are involved with the production process, with the animation, with the manga process, or even with the video games. If you are involved with actually producing official Dragon Ball content, then you simply know things that nobody else can possibly know. So for example, if you were on the production team, you would know what Dragon Ball Daima episode 4 is currently on, even though we don't know that yet because that hasn't been released to us in the West, or even in Japan. Nobody could possibly know that unless you work with the show. For anybody who plays chess, being a Dragon Ball god would basically put you on the level of like a Magnus Carlsen or a Hikaru in terms of your chess ability relative to everybody else being a 2800. If you are at that level, you are basically at the absolute top and know things that is impossible for other people to know, and for all of those reasons you would be considered a Dragon Ball god. But now you're wondering, what in the world can you do with your degree from Dragon Ball University? Well, we have good news and bad news. The good news is that you can become a Dragon Ball YouTuber, and this is something where you can apply your knowledge depending on your degree specification of how much you know Dragon Ball into creating Dragon Ball content ranging from the entertainment type to the intellectual breakdown type. And based off of what you can do, the Dragon Ball community can hire you. Now, this is a committee-based project where you are hired by the Dragon Ball fan base based off of your subscriber count and respect amongst the community, but the bad news is that this is an extremely competitive market, and take it from somebody who's been in this market since it began. So with everything said, guys, these are the 7 levels of Dragon Ball knowledge. But the question now lies, what level are you?